Last set of nervous system notes. Spinal cord and spinal nerves, and then a little bit about the autonomic nervous system. So this is chapter 16 for spinal cord and spinal nerves, and then chapter 18 for autonomic nervous system. So let's just start by reiterating that, of course, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and the spinal nerves come off of the spinal cord. So this is the picture we looked at in the other chapter. So we did brain and cranial nerves, brain, CNS, cranial nerves, PNS. And now we're doing spinal cord, CNS, spinal nerves, PNS. The spinal nerves are the attachments, entrances, exits from the spinal cord. And there are 31 pairs of those. We'll talk about those in just a minute. Let's look at the general features of the spinal cord. Remember that the spinal cord is hollow. It has a central canal. It's small, but it has a central canal in the middle. I'll show you what that looks like. So that's the central canal right in the middle of the spinal cord right there. And that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So it is hollow, like the brain is hollow. It's shorter than people expect it to be. It doesn't go all the way down to the bottom of your sacrum like you would think. It actually ends about L1 or L2. So here it is with reference to the vertebra. Remember that T12 is the last thoracic vertebra, and then the spinal cord proper usually ends about L1 or L2. The vertebra, L1 or L2. So that means it averages about 16 to 18 inches long, of course, longer in a taller person. It's actually relatively small in diameter. The first time I saw one in an actual cadaver, I was pretty blown away by how tiny it is, considering that all that it does. So it's only about ½ an inch in diameter. Now, although the spinal cord ends about L1 or L2, the meninges extend usually down to about S2. So this bag that you see around here is actually the meninges, well, at least two of the meninges. And they extend all the way down to about S2, and they have nerves in them, but not spinal cord in them at that point. So we'll talk about that. This means that, of course, if you needed to remove cerebrospinal fluid, you could do that without risking damage to the central nervous system, as long as you went well below L2. So if you needed to do a lumbar puncture to remove cerebrospinal fluid to, for instance, analyze, you would do between L3 and L4 right here, or between L4 and L5, and then you would actually have to get it through in order to get into the cerebrospinal fluid that's circulating around the spinal cord. You're not trying to get it from the central canal. Then you would need to go through the dura mater and the arachnoid into the subarachnoid space to remove that cerebrospinal fluid. The reason they might do that is to diagnostics, for instance, for maybe you thought someone had the symptoms that could or could not be meningitis. It's one of the diagnostics you could use. The other thing is, if you're doing an epidural anesthetic, you don't go deep in here, but you still would want to do an epidural injection just to be careful below the end of the spinal cord proper, because remember we talked about the fact that if you're talking about regeneration in the nervous system, CNS regeneration is really unlikely, but PNS regeneration is at least possible. Okay, and then there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that are branching off. You can see these pairs of spinal nerves coming, and it would be a spinal nerve if it's coming from anywhere below the foramen magnum, because arbitrarily everything above the foramen magnum that is CNS, that just above the foramen magnum would be the medulla oblongata, and then below would be the spinal cord. So if you came off above the foramen magnum, you would be a cranial nerve. If you came off below, you would be a spinal nerve. So there are 31 pairs, and note, they don't have individual names like the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They are labeled for where they exit the vertebral column, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. And some of them will form these little collections of nerve called plexuses, collections of nerves. There is the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. And then these don't form a plexus. We'll come back to those in just a minute. So you can kind of see them in these pictures as well. So let's look at the anatomy of the spinal cord as a whole, and then we'll look at it in cross-section. So if we look at the spinal cord as a whole, although it's not super visible in this picture, it's actually visible in real life. The area of the spinal cord that's in the cervical region is a little wider, so they call it the cervical enlargement. The reason it's wider is because it's got all of these sensory and motor fibers coming and going to the upper limbs, which of course there's a lot going on with the upper limbs. So that area just has a lot of coming and going, and this area is a little wider. And then the thoracic region gets a little narrower, and again, not super obvious in this picture, but true. The lumbar region, this little region right before the spinal cord proper ends, it's actually wider as well, and that's called the lumbar enlargement. And then extending from, let's blow this up just a little bit so you can see it a little better. Extending from, from the end of the spinal cord proper, you have a few things that you need to know down at the end of the spinal cord. Okay, so the end of the spinal cord proper is called the conus medullaris, which literally means cone in the middle. So the conus medullaris, that is the cone-shaped end of the spinal cord proper, and it's about L1 or L2. And then there is all of these are not CNS, they're mostly nerves that come off the end of the spinal cord and still go through the vertebral canal. They're still in the vertebral canal, or the vertebral cavity after the spinal cord ends, but they're not CNS, they're PNS. This collectively is called the cauda equina, and you can actually see it here as well. And cauda equina means horsetail. So someone thought that all of these nerves looked kind of like a horsetail. So let's show you in this cadaver photo as well. So the conus medullaris, let me draw a picture around it. The conus medullaris goes. Okay, so that's the cone-shaped end of the spinal cord proper. And then the cauda equina extends beyond that, and it's all of that stuff that you are actually seeing running in the vertebral cavity after the end of the conus medullaris, with the exception that one of those little strings is actually not a nerve. And it actually looks like a different texture. And it is this little guy right here. It goes all the way up to the end of the spinal cord proper, and it's called the filum terminale. And filum terminale means last hair. In this picture over on this side, the filum terminale is drawn in, I think, green. Yeah, it's drawn in green over here. So let me show you. And the filum terminale is actually not nervous. The filum terminale is not nervous tissue. It's not a nerve. What it is connective tissue covered with pia mater. And it attaches the end of the spinal cord proper all the way down to the coccyx, anchoring the spinal cord within the vertebral cavity, and that's the filum terminale. Okay, so one more time. End of the spinal cord proper is the conus medullaris. So the conus medullaris, that's the end of the spinal cord proper, and it is labeled here, and that would be CNS tissue. And then the cauda equina is all of the PNS tissue that runs after the end of the spinal cord proper. And in the middle of the cauda equina is one non-nervous structure, which is the filum terminale, which is that connective tissue covered in pia mater that attaches the end of the spinal cord to the coccyx. Okay, so I'm going to do the cross section of the spinal cord in the next video.